Welcome to the Leading at the Next Level podcast with Gov Development Consulting, a show built to provide ongoing support for your leadership journey. Before we move into today's lesson, let's make sure that we're on the same page. We've seen firsthand how much more is required to provide authentic leadership to a team than to simply manage based on the authority that comes with a title or a position. What we've learned through more than 50 combined years of leadership responsibility is that taking the extra steps to serve people, earn influence, will always produce results that barking orders never will. If you'll stick with us to the end of this episode, we'll share how you can get complimentary trial to a resource we've built that's like nothing else you've ever seen. Now, with that in mind, let's get to work. This episode continues in our look at the cost of disengaged employees and digs into how effective leadership drives employee engagement. By this point, I feel like we ought to have a solid understanding of just how much profitability truly is being killed in whatever size organization you're part of. Just with those average numbers, just with looking at some of the stuff that I threw out there loosely in the conservative stuff we just heard, but knowing the issue exists and having a plan to address it, gosh, those are two very, very different things, right? So we're going to wrap up this whole thing by looking at the this whole look at the cost of disengaged employees with a couple really simple practical steps. That's what I like, simple, practical, that I believe any leader can take to begin capturing that lost profitability. Before we do that, though, before we go through the how we can capture it, let's really think about why it really matters, and not why it matters to our bottom line, but why it matters to each and every member of our team. Now, I want you to think long and hard about the kind of leadership that you need in order to deliver that 50% improvement in discretionary effort that I've said so many times here, because I think it's a critical number. And let's be honest, it's a big statement for them to be able to say 57% improvement in discretionary effort. That's significant. And it's not a factor of somebody that's already given it everything they've got, their 100% capacity, just dialing it up a few notches, right? Nobody can give 157%. There's no such thing. I remember hearing a story from the late John Wooden. He was a famous UCLA basketball coach who won 10 NCAA national championships in a 12-year period. Pretty unheard of still today. And he used to tell his teams that the most anybody could ever give at any one point in time was 100%. He explained to them that on the days that they decided to show up and only do 80 or 90, thinking, gosh, I'll just give it extra the next day, that was lost forever, because it's physically impossible to do more than 100%. We are who we are. That's our capacity is what it is. We'll never make it up. Now, with that in mind, what I'll say is, how in the world could anybody possibly ever deliver a 57% increase on discretionary effort? So I got out my handy dandy calculator, did some quick math, and tried to figure out what was the most somebody could be really delivering if they could do a 57% increase in discretionary effort. And playing around with the numbers a little bit, I found that 63.5 was the most possible somebody could be doing if they could get to a 57%. And the way I did that, I took 1.57 for that 157%, and I tried to figure out how close can I get to 100. Call me later if you have questions on the math, but it worked out to be 63.5 was the most they could have been given. Now, for the sake of argument, let's just stick with the folks who are neither actively engaged nor actively disengaged. And let's assume our actively engaged folks are already rowing as hard as they're capable of. They're doing everything they can. And as I mentioned before, I think it'd be a far better use of our time to maybe the folks that are actively disengaged, let's get them out of the stinking boat and just not mess with them so they're not creating extra drag. If we use those numbers that I shared before from Gallup's 2022 State of the Global Workforce Report, that leaves us that 60%, okay, of our team who may well only be performing at or likely below that 63.5% of their total capacity. Now, I'm not going to pretend to speak for you, but I've certainly never accomplished much. I've never felt good about my accomplishment or felt like it's of any real significance by only giving 63.5% of my best effort, right? It usually takes more than that, doesn't it? Now, with that being just as applicable for the majority of the folks that work for us, I don't think there's a whole lot of question as to how much profitability that really is killing in our organizations when the majority of our folks, 60%, are in that 63% productivity range. And we often don't see it because we're getting by and they're meeting the numbers and so on. So back to my previous question, what does a leader need to do to really earn that additional, that 57% additional improvement discretionary effort? I'm going to tell you, I don't think they're going to do it by pounding their chest and reminding us that they're in charge. That's just not going to get it. I truly believe that one of our biggest separations between supervising or managing and genuinely leading is earning that influence and developing relationships. Now, covering even the best talking points in a supervisor meeting or whatever in front of the team, that's not going to get it done. That's not going to make much difference unless we have solid follow through. So for now, I want to challenge you to think about in your mind, what specific things did the best leaders that you've ever worked with or around, what have they done to really earn that extra from you? What were the things that they did for you? What did you see from them? And while it's likely a bit different for each of us, I feel like there are some basics that are going to apply across the board. Now, think back to that comment that I've been referencing here over and over about that so-called fuzzy initiative driven by somebody in HR that never yields tangible results. And the fellow that made that comment when he originally posted on my LinkedIn article a while back, he went on to explain that it was because he said most CEOs continue to sit on the sidelines and let HR whack away at the problem. Now, I believe we've covered enough firm data and we've got a strong enough picture to really eliminate the question of whether or not it really is tangible, whether those results are achievable by working to improve employee engagement. Quite frankly, I believe that's the only way to address this particular profitability killer. Is we've got to work to earn it. We've got to really build that engagement through the leadership that we earn with our teams. Now, what I do want you to do is think about that list that I just asked you to create about the specific things the best leader you ever worked for did to earn that extra from you. Now, before working through my own list, I need to ask you one more thing as it relates to your list, okay? Were those things that inspired you or motivated you or earned your active engagement, were they done solely by somebody in the human resources department? Now, in case you're wondering, it's rhetorical. I would be utterly stunned if anybody could say, yes, the human resource manager or somebody in the human resource department was the sole motivator and they earned my extra engagement, because I've just never seen it happen. And quite frankly, I was one of those human resource people, and I know all too well the need for somebody higher up the food chain to be casting a vision to really earn engagement. Gosh, when I no longer had it myself after almost 2 decades with the same organization, the work that I was doing lost the majority of its purpose, and I said, hey, I'm going to do something different. I'm just not bought into this anymore. So I know personally how much that needs to be there, and from somebody outside of the human resource. So I'm not trying to throw them under the bus. I'm explaining the purpose here. Now, all that said, if that fellow that I traded those comments with had only ever seen the HR folks he was working with deal with anything related to engagement, I absolutely understand why he had the perspective he did. But it absolutely should not be that way. In fact, I found an article on Gallup that was put together from Gallup. It was called "Who's Responsible for Employee Engagement?" And it backed my opinion. And it said, engagement isn't just an HR thing. Go figure, right? It went on to say managers account for 70% of the variance in team engagement. There are no quick fixes when it comes to human relationships. It is essential that managers effectively interact with and develop each team member over time. Now, don't misunderstand me here. I'm not bashing the human resource profession, not this time at least. They have a very, very distinct and critical role. In many cases, those are the folks who are providing the tools for the supervisors, the managers, the executives, so they can effectively interact with, like that quote said, and develop the team members over time, right? But they're rarely going to be the one doing it with every single individual team member on a routine basis. They might have some interaction, but they're not going to touch every person every day. That's where the supervisors, the managers, the executives come into play. Now, before we move on, to really listen and detail on the specifics you or any other leader on your team for that matter can really take to earn that engagement and get that discretionary effort, I believe it's important to keep one thing in mind, and it's rarely a manager I'm sorry, it's rarely a matter of a manager not wanting better performance or simply not being willing to develop their team members. It's nearly always because they just don't know how to go about it, and that's not necessarily their fault. The Gallup article went on to say there are no quick fixes, right? When it comes to human relationships. And let's be honest, so many supervisors, managers, executives, even business owners, they've worked their way up through the ranks based on a completely different set of skills, a different expertise, if you will. And the tools that they use to get there, the technical skills, if you will, are often not the ones that they're going to need to really interact effectively with their teams and earn that engagement. And since that's the case, let's review a list of what I think are some simple things that we need to do, and then we'll wrap up with a look at this particular profitability killer by laying out some very, very practical steps that we can implement and I believe sustain too, because they're simple enough to put in place so we can really put some of this away. So I mentioned earlier that we'd work through some simple things and that we could do for earning that engagement, and we're going to, okay? Here's the thing though, just identifying those simple things, let alone taking action to really sustain them over time, isn't always that simple, but I believe it should be. And we'll walk through that a little bit. I found an article on Forbes that was called Six Ways Leaders Can Boost Employee Engagement and Why It's Important. It shared 6 ways. The author suggested here's these 6 things that are necessary for getting that 60% or so we've been of folks that we've been talking about who are just along for the ride, how we can get them to pick up their oars and contribute to the cause, if you will. Another article from Forbes, it was titled How Leaders Can Improve Employee Engagement Even During Challenging Times. And it referenced early on, it referenced this thing. It said the 3 C's of employee engagement. And I was so hopeful that it was 3 instead of 6, because my goodness, I didn't want 6 things. And I had to read the article 2 different times, top to bottom, before I could find what it was referring to as those 3 C's, which was clear, consistent communication, because they were buried within 8 things that the article was suggesting. So it was really, really confusing. Why do I share that? And before I say why I share that, I'm not taking issue with any of those things, not the 6 or the 8. All of them were decent. We'll circle back to that in a little bit. What I'm going to say is I'm fairly simple, and I want to provide you with a simple list. And I don't believe throwing 14 things at you is going to seem all that simple. Further, I don't know anybody that I've ever met in any type of leadership role who's had an abundance of spare time that said, hey, I can add just one more thing easily, let alone a dozen or more things. So we need to really hone it in and figure out how can we do this simply so we can indeed sustain it. I've often referenced a book called The Truth About Employee Engagement by Patrick Lencioni. He shares this fascinating fable about this retired executive. He buys a minority stake in a rundown pizza joint near somewhere in Utah, Salt Lake City, somewhere in Utah. I forget exactly where, but he buys this rundown pizza joint. And through the process, this executive, he lands on 3 things that he's convinced that are just as critical to that evening crew shift in that tiny little restaurant as they were to the corporate team that he ran in his former company where he was the CEO. And he felt like they were just as applicable in between. Now, Lencioni lists this thing called immeasurement, irrelevance, and anonymity is what he believes contributes to making employees miserable in their work experience. Now, his fictional pizza joint story, it goes on to talk about how the main character works to offset each of those for the individuals on his evening shift and how much the business's overall results improve. Now, if you've ever read anything by Lencioni, I have no doubt you understand why I connect with it so much. His stories are short, they're fun, and he weaves in a solid message every time. He's just good at what he does with that. The reality that I've had to come to terms with over the last 20 years is that if we, as leaders, that we're never going to have enough time to do everything that demands our attention. We need to build systems into our routine so we can achieve as much as we possibly can every single day. And even then, we better make sure that those systems are simple so we can have that, we can sustain them on a day in, day out basis when the stuff's going to hit the fan. And believe me, regardless of how good at we are at what we do, the stuff is going to hit the fan. Now, if we truly want to earn, and I stress earn, that engagement from the teams we lead, being intentional about providing them with clear measurement for the work, the relevance of that work, while removing the anonymity that's far too common in even small businesses today. We'll do all that so much more effectively when we can build a simple system in place for doing that day in, day out.
Thanks for listening to the Leading at the Next Level podcast. Next time, we'll pick up where we left off by digging into some specific steps that leaders can take to improve employee engagement. If you'd like to go deeper into anything that we've shared here, or you need continuing education credits for your professional credentials, send us an email at admin@dove-development.net, and we'll be happy to hook you up with a 45-day all-access trial to our complete Leading at the Next Level program at no cost. The full program, it includes access to well over 100 hours of digital lessons, complete with slides and action-based assessments to help you capture measurable bottom line improvements in your organization. And it includes access to 2 live lessons each month that close with Q&A, so we can help you identify the specific action you want to take to lead your team more effectively.